Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Amazing podcast, where we talk about all things cloud native and Kubernetes. My name is Twain Taylor. I'm the editor at Amazing, and we want to bring you conversations from different leaders and influencers uh, and pretty much doers in the space who are building cool stuff. And that's what we're doing today as well. If you like what you hear on this episode, go and check out all of the other episodes we've done to date. There's many of them. We've covered so many startups and open source projects over the past 2 to 3 years. And you can also head to our website, amazic.com, amazic.com, where we have a whole lot more apart from these podcasts. So go check it out. Today I have with me Tom Callway, who is the VP marketing at Solo. I don't know if we pronounce it solo.io, which is the website, or you just say Solo. Tom, good to
Either's
have
fine.
you.
Either's
How do
fine.
you, sorry,
Yeah.
yeah. How do you say it normally, the company?
Well, it's either. I think the official name is solo.io, but for the sake of brevity, people just refer it to Solo. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite. Really, really great to be here.
Oh, yeah, looking forward to our chat. There's so much to dig into. But before we get into the meat of it, I was wondering if you can tell us a bit about yourself, give us an intro about just your background and just leading up to Solo, what you've been up to and what led you to Solo.
Great. Well, thanks for the question. I've been involved in open source IT infrastructure and IT operations for over 20 years, and I started fairly shortly after completing my master's. I did master's in something completely different, which was international relations, and I'd been working a little bit in legal publishing and various things, but it was, it wasn't really my core interest. And I started messing around with Linux, which was very new, I think, at the time. And, Ubuntu hadn't come along, which made actually installing Linux much easier on regular laptops. And so I was messing around with things like Debian Linux and stuff like that, which Ubuntu was ultimately based on. And fell in with a group of people who were also fellow enthusiasts, and we set up a consulting company in West London, which specialised in going into organisations and taking out a lot of their Microsoft infrastructure and replacing it with Linux and with Samba for file shares and for Squid HTTP proxy, and OpenLDAP was to replace Active Directory, and so I did that with these guys for about 5 years. I eventually moved on to other roles. I worked in the observability space. I was marketing director at MariaDB, which is now a widely used open source database. It was a spin-off from MySQL. So I did all of that, and then I eventually went to work for Canonical, the guys behind Ubuntu, and I was director of cloud marketing there for a time. And that was really my introduction into, I think, more sort of cloud sort of infrastructure. So we were doing a lot of work around AWS, because at the time, I think 70% of all Linux distributions or virtual machines that were being spun up on AWS were running Ubuntu. That was a revenue stream for Canonical. But my particular specialism was in OpenStack. So that was an open source project that attempted to really provide private cloud services to enterprises, it was very cool back in the day, and it's still around, but it was pretty complicated, and was only really enthusiastically adopted by the telco community because they have the kind of the scale and the sophistication to really justify that kind of investment. And then there was this thing called Kubernetes, and Kubernetes was really much more readily adopted. Docker was obviously taking was on the peak hype cycle, and Kubernetes was the orchestration of those Docker containers. And I eventually became the head of European marketing for a company called Rancher Labs, which were 2 really fantastic years, an amazing company with great leadership, really inspirational business model as well. It was all driving adoption, and it was all about innovation. We eventually, 2019 was just this completely fantastic blowout year. We smashed our targets, and we all went to Mexico, to Baja, Mexico, place called Cabu, on a kind of President's Club stroke company sort of jamboree type thing to celebrate. And we were all drinking in the bar, and somebody said, "Have you heard of this thing called COVID?" I was like, "What's that?" And of course, by the time a few weeks later we got home after having this fantastic business vacation, we came back and everything was shut down. And Rancher Labs, then the guys in the company decided that it's probably, they decided that it was a good time to look for a buyer. And eventually, it came down to a couple of fairly significant IT companies were interested in buying Rancher, and the one that did so successfully was SUSE, who was, it's a German IT Linux distribution, been around for a long time, and they wanted to expand into the Kubernetes space. They'd had a Kubernetes project for a while called CAS, I think, which hadn't really resonated with their target audience, and so they invested in Rancher because it was so much more popular. And I ended up going over to SUSE initially as an IC because it's a much larger organization, and then they just started giving me people to manage, and I ended up as the VP of product marketing there. But I was looking after all sorts of different teams as well: customer marketing, technical marketing, community marketing as well. So I had this kind of fairly complicated team. And I was there for 2.5 years, something like that. All in the whole Rancher SUSE experience was about 5 years or just over 5 years. And then eventually I got a call from Solo, and Solo looked a lot like Rancher did when I joined Rancher in terms of the space that it was in, the size of the company, the story behind it, albeit it was a higher level than Kubernetes cluster management, which is what we did at Rancher. But the dynamics seemed right. So I joined Salo about 8 months ago.
All right. Okay, neat. Wow. I really want to jump into the solo part, but I'm really curious to know a little more about just your Rancher story, because
Right.
there was quite a big acquisition at that time,
Yeah.
one of the biggest.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know how it went finally. So, how did SUSE kind of handle the, integration, the merger? Did it go well for SUSE and for Rancher, the team, or what are your comments?
I think parts of it were successful. I mean, we're talking about fairly significant acquisitions, and I mean, SUSE has integrated the Rancher portfolio or Rancher into its portfolio, and the GM of Rancher is still my former boss there, who was the CMO at Rancher, a guy called Pete Smales. So I think that that there has been a fairly high degree of continuity. There's still a lot of Rancher people at SUSE. Of course, people decide to go off and do their own thing. The founders of Rancher, they went off and they formed their own company called Acorn Labs. And Acorn, I think, are now in the AI space, for example. So, people go and do their own thing. But I've got a lot of time for the people at SUSE. That it's a very established business with a really sort of solid business model, and I think looking back with the benefit of hindsight, the acquisition of Rancher by them was a really good thing. I think they were culturally pretty aligned. I mean, the reality is, though, in that space is that you've got Red Hat that was acquired by IBM about 6 or 8 months or so before Rancher was acquired. They've gone from strength to strength. They're significantly larger, and so a lot of that kind of on-prem hybrid sort of use case has been consumed by them, particularly the larger businesses. So they already had a huge footprint of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which was obviously leveraged to then migrate a lot of those customers over to OpenShift, which is what they've got, and they've got a significant enterprise footprint. Much of the rest of the people using Kubernetes are using managed Kubernetes on one of the major clouds, EKS, AKS, and GKE in particular, but there are others, of course. So I mean, I think it's one of those, like everything in IT infrastructure, given some time, I think the cloud providers will suck up a lot of the air in that market, and the market will adapt accordingly. So
Wow, that's a cool story. That you got to be part of the acquisition, and good to know
oh,
Rancher is still.
it was
Uh,
great. No, I mean it was
yeah.
absolutely fantastic, and made some really great friendships with the people there. I think, and for it to all happen during COVID too, when we were all stuck at home. And I think we were very fortunate that whilst people were being laid off, or what they
Mhm.
were furloughed, or whatever, and nobody really knew what was happening.
Mhm.
Rancher adapted very easily. We had an even bigger year in 2020 than we did the previous year, and so we came into the acquisition like a rocket ship, really. And so it was, and with a very sort of stable environment, and a high growth environment to benefit from. So I was very, very lucky. And of course, quite shortly after SUSE acquired Rancher, SUSE IPO'd on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. And so I benefited from that too, which was great. So it was a very, very exciting period of my career. Yeah.
Wow, wow, that's quite a story. So I want to get to Solo.
Right.
Solo, the name kind of reminds me of us going on a solo trip or lead solo. It seems to imply one thing, but then I was looking at the Solo website, and it seems like you do more than one thing. But of course, I think networking broadly, you could say, is the
I
one thing.
think so.
But then,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, but it seems like there's within networking, there's like service mesh, which is a huge space, and then API gateway, which there's some overlap, but then that also is kind of its own little space within the cloud native landscape.
yeah.
I think you're dipping your toes into platform engineering. So,
Mm.
yeah, tell us about Solo, and why the name Solo, and how do you see all of these different things that Solo does? How do they come together? What's the story of Solo?
Yeah. Well, I can do that. Maybe I'll share a sort of a deck to help sort of talk you through just the sort of super high level pitch of where we fit in.
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
but as far as the name is concerned, I think it really derives from this desire to simplify API management, quite frankly. So rather than being, sort of solo in a negative sense, not working with anybody or whatever, it's more a case of there's so much complexity when it comes to doing application networking, and the way in which APIs sort of interact. That's well known, and the mission of the business is to simplify the consumption of what at the end of the day are pretty complex technologies. So I think that's probably where it comes from. And of course, Glue, which is the kind of product brand name for our application networking products, is all about gluing different systems together. It doesn't take that much imagination. But that's where I think Edith Levine, who's the CEO, got the name from. But as far as our story, let me just grab some, because I think sometimes it's useful to get some slides up here. Oh no, I won't be able to find
Yeah,
them. Oh, here we go. And it's just going to be super quick. I don't want to take up too much time. But basically, there's this the problem statement is called the last mile problem of cloud native applications. In the development of microservices based applications has kind of been addressed from a technology perspective by Docker, by containers. And the orchestration, the provisioning and orchestration of those containers has largely been addressed by Kubernetes and Terraform and so forth. But the last mile problem exists because that connection between the applications and the end user and the consumption of that application, the service that it provides, there's no standard pattern. There's basically no standardization. And you can see here that there's a number of different attempts at doing that, common patterns that have occurred within the industry to try and ensure that networking is secure, and there's control and so forth. But there's no real standardization, and that's resulted in a bunch of real challenges around. There aren't any common tools, particularly. It's very difficult to get zero trust. Automation is very challenging if there's no consistency and standardization. Multi-cloud is also challenging, of course, and it leads to broken experiences. So there is sort of light at the end of that particular tunnel, though. Of course, the open source community is often the source of much innovation. And there are a number of key projects that have been developed that actually, when used together, help to address that last mile problem. And we refer to those technologies as projects using an acronym, or the combination of those projects using an acronym called CAKES, which stands for Cilium as a C and I, then Ambient, which is, I'll talk about more probably later on in the interview, which is the sidecarless version of Istio, Kubernetes itself for container orchestration, Envoy proxy, which is the basis of both the sidecars within regular Istio, but also our Glue Gateway product, and also Spiffy Spire as well, which is kind of like a standard framework for the usage of these technologies. Those together do address many of the problems that we've seen before in terms of standardization. But as with all open source projects, assembly is still required. There's a lot of, there's still organizations out there that have the internal capacity to take these projects, upstream projects, deploy them, integrate them, and manage them longer term. But there's not many, honestly. And large organizations taking on open source projects of any type, they are taking on inherent risk. There's no throat to choke. If they get into problems, it's up to them to solve them. So that's really where we come in as Solo and the Glue products, because we package up the cake stack and then turn them into products that are fully supported. And we also add in enterprise grade sort of capabilities. And really the two major products within the Glue portfolio, Glue Gateway and Glue Mesh. We also have a kind of a minor product called Glue Network for Cilium as well, which for people who just want Cilium CNI with the Glue interface, they can get that product. But our core application networking products are Glue Gateway and Glue Mesh, and they really take those open source projects, package them up in a way that allows for improved developer experience, and reduces the cost of onboarding a lot of these technologies, because you're really shortening that time to value experience as well, and also adds in a huge amount of insight too, in that Solo is a bit of a there's quite a few sort of Istio rock stars knocking about within Istio, and the knowledge that they have has been encapsulated in the tool set into our insights engine, and delivers that kind of proactive recommendations for operators to use our tools. So it's those sorts of things that aren't present upstream, but they can be found within Glue Gateway and Glue Mesh. But there is a missing space actually that we've recently identified, which is where our backstage-based product Spotlight comes in as well, and that's really bringing the story together in that, as part of our attempts to, the help that we give organizations onboarding Glue Gateway and Glue Mesh. It really requires, it's not just, you don't just install this software and turn it on and it works. It really does require a kind of a cultural shift, essentially, the adoption of DevOps at a fairly sophisticated level. I mean, everybody needs an API gateway, particularly mesh products. That's the signal. If an organization is at Istio, for example, that's the signal that they're quite a long way down in terms of maturation of their cloud native use cases and expertise. In order to get there, they need to adopt DevOps culture, but they also need to operationalize that with platform engineering practices. And Backstage, as an IDP and internal developer platform, is very much the epicenter of platform engineering practices within the cloud native ecosystem. And so it's something that's actually included in Glue Gateway as a subset of the Glue Gateway functionality, but it's something that we have a lot of expertise in internally. And so we are talking to a lot of our customers at the moment about helping them get Spotlight, which is based on Backstage, and helping them deploy that internally using best practices and integrating that with our existing application networking products. So that's kind of at a very high level what it is that we do as a business, and how we are inspired by the innovations within the cloud native ecosystem, and then we package those up and we monetize those around delivering enterprise grade capabilities, shortening that time to value, and the expertise that we deliver with the subscriptions that we sell.
Wow. Yeah, wonderful response. I think you kind of summarized our whole conversation in that response, and we're going to dig into bits and pieces of that in the next few minutes. I was wondering if you could back up to the second slide that you just showed us.
This one here?
Yeah. And I want to just start with talking about the problem not yet solved, that section. I see there's 3 parts. And I was wondering if you could kind of pick one of them and explain it a bit more. Which of these is the most gnarly problem that needs solving and is probably the most prevalent? I see three of them. There's infrastructure everywhere. There's single point of access and unobserved
Yeah.
traffic. If you could
Well,
talk
I mean
to
yeah, they're all really important actually in terms of very representative of the challenges of doing networking efficiently within a fairly ephemeral kind of environment. So you're taking applications that are, you've deconstructed the monolith, and you're now creating microservices based applications that which are made up of separate containerized workloads that need to be linked together, and they're ephemeral. They're coming and going. So from a networking perspective, the kind of infrastructure that a lot of organizations have in place is not set up for success when it comes to either taking existing applications and breaking them up, or adopting new microservices based applications. Because if your networking infrastructure is based on legacy practices, where you had a fixed IP address for a monolithic application, and you want to adapt more sort of cloud native practices, but your networking doesn't evolve with you, you're stuck really. So the hairpinning one, for example, with Apogee, in order to try and control the sort of the chaos in quotation marks of microservices based applications within your environment, you're taking fairly legacy, in this case Apogee, and API Gateway has been around for ages, fairly legacy products, and trying to square peg round hole that into an environment that it's not really built for success there. In the same way, if you have traditional firewalls and stuff like that, and perimeter kind of security, and that was kind of the traditional way of preventing people from hacking into your network. That doesn't really work within a microservices-based environment, because you actually need to set up zero trust. So once they're inside, they can't do any damage. So every interaction with all the different components of your microservices environment, they need to be secured as well. So that's where sort of service mesh, in particular, once they're in, ensuring that each endpoint is encrypted, that's really essential. And traditional networking practices, it's not really set up for success in that way. And of course, as part of that networking experience, particularly from a service mesh perspective, but also from a gateway perspective, traditional observability tools don't really cut it either. I used to work for an observability company back in the day that used Nagios, for example, as the underlying technology for their observability platform, and it was fine for traditional network environments, where you've got fixed IP addresses and everything else, because Nagios is it's probably 30 years old now, and that it's a technology that had a certain shelf life, but is not suitable for the brave new world of cloud native, and particularly when it comes to observability. You just don't get any insight into what's going right and what's going wrong, and so if you don't have any standardization within that layer, it's just very difficult to start getting the benefits of that cloud native transformation that so many companies are on. You can, if you don't start thinking about adopting cloud native API gateways and service mesh and things like that, you can get away with it for a while. But as soon as you get to a certain scale and complexity, you can't really ignore it for much longer. So that's when you need to start looking at the cake stack and specifically Glue.
Oh, interesting. So when it comes to like talking about service mesh and API gateway, like you said, Apogee has existed since really long back, and Istio has been popular for a while.
2004. It was their first release was in 2004. I mean, that's like 20 years ago. That's pretty crazy. I think they've evolved since then somewhat, but yeah, I mean, it's essentially a legacy technology that's been acquired and reinvented and so forth. But it's have challenges if you're taking fairly legacy technology and trying to adapt it for environments that it hasn't been built for.
Yeah. And so it seems like Solo has really brought together a lot of these open source projects and tools that you mentioned, Istio, Cilium, and a few others. And so there's definitely a lot of simplifying involved where, it makes a difference to day-to-day operations when managing
Mhm.
networking. Could you talk a bit on, apart from the simplifying, saving time, which of course is probably one of the biggest benefits, but apart from that, are there also additional capabilities and features that Solo adds on top of the open source projects, which you wouldn't otherwise get if you were to do it yourself? Could you talk a bit
Yeah,
on what those features could be?
yeah, sure. Well, I think that user experience is really important. Particularly if you want, because I mean, sort of hardcore sort of developers and things. Maybe they're fine to operate within a CLI environment, or they're editing YAML files and doing all that kind of stuff. But the majority of operations people want to have a logical user experience, a UI, basically, to interact with these complex products and just to make their life easier. And that doesn't really come upstream. You're getting the bare bones if you're just using the projects upstream. And often, there's people out there doing DIY stuff or whatever. But we've invested a lot of time in ensuring that these technologies are consumed in an environment that people find quite intuitive. So I guess that's the first thing. The second thing is from a security perspective as well. I mean, security doesn't just happen by switching stuff on. It requires a lot of additional insight and layered capability into the product to ensure, zero trust communication and so forth. So that's included within Glue out of the box. That doesn't come with the upstream projects by default. You'd have to do that by yourself, which is by no means a simple thing to do. And then the observability tools are another area we've already talked about. So we not only integrate with other open source observability tools that are free, like Grafana and so forth, but we also have our own pretty sophisticated observability capabilities within Glue that our customers are really benefit from. And then I think the last thing that comes to mind is the insights engine, which I think I probably mentioned a little bit before. In that, there's one thing when it comes to observability. There's one thing to have the tools to be able to identify problems within your environment, to see the red flags or whatever. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll know what to do once you see those flags. And so Glue does contain an insights engine which proactively suggests remediation actions that you can take in order to resolve those problems. And I think that kind of proactive help, as well as having the ability to, you'll have a Slack channel or whatever as a customer, or you can raise a ticket in Zendesk or whatever. Having that human expertise as a backup is something that all of our customers benefit from, because whether they're a smaller SME who's deploying this sort of stuff and maybe pretty advanced in their cloud native journey, or whether they're a global global brand, the Amexes of this world, or Domino's Pizza, or whatever it might be, who we're very proud to have as customers. They're very much at the bleeding edge, and they're helping to define the market, and having access to some of the the world's leading expertise particularly when it comes to Istio. I mean, we've got people like John Howard, who's recently come over to us from Google. Louis Ryan, he's our CTO. He was one of the founders of Istio. Solo has become, in the past 6 months, it's become the biggest contributor to the Istio upstream project from a code contribution perspective. So that expertise is also something that our customers really love to tap into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I looked at your website. We had Craig Box over on the podcast a few months
Yeah,
ago. And
yeah, he's awesome. Yeah, no, he's
yeah,
great. I mean, I've been a huge admirer of Craig for years now. I mean,
yeah.
there aren't. I personally, the podcast there aren't that many really great technology podcasts, and he had a really great one when he was at Google, which was based around Kubernetes. And I used to take dogs for a walk and listen to that and think, how do I get
Mm-hmm.
onto this podcast? And of course, now I
Mm-hmm.
work with him every day. He's based down in New Zealand at the moment, but he used to live around where I live in West London.
Yeah.
But no,
Last time I spoke
he's
to
a
him, he
great
was
guy.
in the
Yeah,
UK.
he's a great guy. No, he's at the kind of the kid stage. He's got
Yeah,
some
moved back.
babies there, and
Yeah.
yeah, he's moved back home. Yeah.
And there's also Christian Posta from, I think he was really like popular on the Red Hat blog, where I read a lot of his stuff, and yeah, really, really good stuff
Yeah,
that he used to write.
he's a rock star, coolest guy. He's awesome. He's fantastic. I mean, my team has to rely a lot on him because he's a wonderful writer. He's written some really great books. It's
Yeah.
highly respected, and when he gives talks at KubeCon, it's like standing room only. He's a really great guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's the energy like? It must be something else, with pretty much so many superstars in the cloud native space, just in one
Yeah,
small, smallish.
yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know, I don't know how many
yeah.
employees you have, but it seems like,
We're filled with
it's quite a team.
technology divas. Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, they're just really down to earth people. All of them. I mean, there's Lynn, who's the sweetest person. Lynn's son, who's also very well known in the cloud native community. Idit Levine, who's the CEO. I mean, she's got an engineering background too and is highly respected. And Craig and Louis and John and all these guys. I mean, yeah, they're just regular people who are extremely good at what they do, and it's a real privilege to work with them. But
Wow.
as a company, it's not the sophistication doesn't really stop there. I mean, some of the things that we're doing from a data science perspective internally that my team benefits from in marketing is I've never seen anything like it before in terms of when it comes to targeting sort of prospective companies, finding out who's at that level of maturation in their cloud native journey and is ready to use service mesh. To do that is it's really very challenging, and we've got some amazingly capable data scientists internally who help my team do that from a marketing perspective, and the go-to-market team do that as well, and I've never seen that anywhere else. So the sophistication in terms of execution is pretty high at the company generally.
Wow, that's amazing. I got just a couple more questions as we wind
Mm.
down.
Mm.
You hinted in passing at sidecarless service mesh, and just a few years back, sidecars were the rage. All the rage, and everyone was talking about how it's great for just abstracting out networking and network security out of the container, and just makes life
Mm.
easier in terms
Mm.
of networking. But then seems like today there's a shift to a sidecarless architecture. Could you talk a bit to that, what it means, and even Solo's take on sidecarless?
Yeah, great question. And I I would say that first of all, sidecar sort of architecture isn't going anywhere. I mean, it does have a huge number of benefits, as you just pointed out. But I think it does introduce, for most organizations and most environments, a level of complexity that's quite intimidating. And so it's technically intimidating. And also, it's very resource intensive as well, and costly as a result, particularly if you're running this sort of cycleless side mesh in the cloud. It can, you can be spending a lot of money just on the Envoy piece. So I think the Istio project in particular was kind of at its zenith in sort of 2019, just before the pandemic. That's when it was like the coolest kid on the block, much like Backstages now. These things, you get these crests of
Mhm.
different height waves and things. But Istio was seen as it having sort of MTLS sort of as default within your environment through the usage of Istio, for example, was very appealing, and that drove a lot of adoption. But the reality was that the vast majority of users at that time uh, were just getting started with Kubernetes, and adopting service mesh, specifically Istio, was probably more than they were capable of handling. They hadn't really reached the necessary level of maturation in order to make the most of a service mesh kind of environment. They didn't have the scale, or they just didn't have the necessary complexity that service mesh would be helpful. And so quite a few people thought, oh, this is a bit too much trouble. It's costing me a lot of money. Maybe I can, go back to what I was doing before, which is fine. Um, a lot of people saw the value of service mesh, even with a sidecar based architecture, and have continued to invest in that. But it's not for everybody, and not everybody can afford it. So we, at Solo, have been working with Google for a couple of years now on a project called Ambient, And Ambient is it's being
How
rolled
do you
out as
spell that?
beta.
How do you
Ambient
spell that?
is yeah, it's
Ambient. Oh,
AB yeah AMBIENT.
okay. All
It's
right.
basically a mode, a new feature within Istio that enables
Mhm.
you to switch on and switch off sidecars in Istio. So uh, so uh, with Ambient, and it's a very seamless experience as well in terms of turning it on. Um, Not having the same capabilities without the sidecar-based infrastructure obviously addresses the complexity problem, and it really does address the consumption problem and the cost problem. So some of our customers are already using Ambient. They've experienced like 80% cost reductions as soon as they switch it on because they're not paying for sidecars, particularly when they're using them in the cloud. And so we developed that with Google over the past couple of years. It's going to be live or at beta, which is in our world is pretty, it's production ready, I guess. Certainly in the application networking space at beta. So it's going to be introduced in the next release of Istio, which I believe is 1.22. That's coming out towards the end of this month. It's been adopted by AWS already. So if you want Ambient in your Istio, that's already available in AWS. Azure is adopting it. Google Cloud is adopting it. So very much a sign, I think, that sidecarless Istio that allows for greater simplification and also significantly the cost reduction of using service mesh. That we're hoping is going to be a boost for new adoption and new use cases for Istio service mesh in particular. So that's the thing I'm really excited about, I think, for the remainder of the year, is seeing how readily Ambient is actually adopted. And ergo, as more people start using Ambient, the popularity of Istio, seeing a kind of a second wave of adoption of service mesh is pretty exciting, because I think once you've got that in place and you can start benefiting from service mesh capabilities, coupled with a cloud native API gateway that's built for that kind of environment, as well as opposed to just repurposing stuff you bought 10 years ago, I think that's a pretty, that's a really exciting opportunity for us as a company.
All right. So you're watching Ambient for the rest of this year. That was actually going to be my next question. But as you look ahead for the year or two ahead, what do you see on the horizon for either solo or the space in general? What are you
Yeah,
keeping in mind? Definitely Ambient is one of them. Is there anything else that you'd
yeah.
like to mention as we close out?
Well, I mean, just in terms of our investment in our roadmap, I think there's some really exciting things coming up. Generally, not all of them I can talk about, but of course, we're exploring AI use cases as well. Particularly with our API gateway. I think there's a lot of noise in the AI space at the moment. A lot of people are just kind of trying to sprinkle that AI pixie dust over their existing products, but basically they're describing AI use cases as opposed to AI features. I think as soon as you get AI LLM models involved in your application networking, there's a level of latency involved in that, which is just completely unacceptable from a networking perspective. But nevertheless, there's still there's a lot of I think demand within the market for AI-enabled networking, using using that to drive efficiencies and things like that. We're already working on that, as you're probably not surprised. And I'm going to be in Las Vegas next week for the Gartner event there, which is the AIBS event, which is happening there, and we're going to have some demos on the booth there to talk about what we're doing within that space, basically using Glue Gateway as a means of controlling enterprise traffic out to LLM models and then back again to ensure that ensuring the security of intellectual property, basically, so people within your organization aren't just sending out IP over to these LLM models and they're expecting expecting answers. That does represent a fairly significant security risk, and so we're using our API gateway product, Glue Gateway, to control that, help our customers control that. But that's just the beginning. We need to how we make application networking more intelligent from using AI. I think is a very exciting space.
You should definitely come back and talk to us about
Sure,
these things
I would
once
love
they
to.
launch your AI features or even Ambient when it launches. But yeah, that was quite a conversation. There was so much we covered in a short time. It was a great conversation. Before you go, though, Tom, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about yourself. What would be your alternate career path if not for your job in
Oh,
tech marketing?
well,
You'd be doing?
yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I've been doing this so long now. I think I've become conditioned into not really thinking about anything else. I've got some passions, like outside of work. I love my racing. I'm a big F1 fan. I'm a member of Goodwood, which is not too far away from me here in West London. So I go down to the meetings, and I'm not a petrol head exactly, but I love my racing. I love anything mechanical. I'm a big fan of watches, so I've got I've got a bit of a collection going. There's another passion.
Mhm.
Maybe in a different life, I would have pursued careers in either of those passions, but I've been doing this now for over 20 years, so I think I'm going to be doing it for the rest of my career. To be fair.
All right, all right. Wow, really cool. Yeah, it was a pleasure chatting with you, Tom. Thanks so much for
Too, Tom.
joining us
Okay,
and just sharing just so much of the backstory of Rancher and even Solo. Just yeah, it's a great product, but then I think the teams behind them and bringing out that backstory is quite interesting, which we touched on in this conversation. So quite enjoyed
great,
it. So much for joining
great.
us.
That was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And to all of our listeners and viewers, we thank you also for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we'll see you on the next one.